right that we might only have around 4,000 weeks to live.
How do you even figure out what constitutes a meaningful life for you?
I'm very aligned with this concept of an imperfectionist and an insecure overachiever.
This is the idea of kind of person who is driven, probably successful, but really feeling like not enough, and as a result doing things that other people's standards might count as sort of more than enough.
Oliver Burkeman helps people focus on intentional productivity,
teaching them to embrace time limits to prioritize what truly matters.
Why doesn't increased productivity guarantee a happier life?
I think the context in which I'd put this is that
I would just work my way through the day and all I would think is, oh my gosh, I've still got all of this left to do. I'd have no accountability of anything that I'd done.
because what you're dealing with is an effectively infinite supply of emails, of demands from other people, you just get busier and more stressed. If you get really good and fast at responding to your email, the result is that you get much more email. The reward, as people say, for good time management is more work. It's not that we've got like a bucket of tasks and it's our job to empty the bucket.
Where should people start on this concept to have this kind of more calmer life that isn't so task focused all the time?
One thing that I think has been a really important thing for me is
we want to make sure these conversations get to as many people as possible. By following this show and leaving a review, you can help these conversations reach the people they need to. If you send a screenshot of your follow and review to @SarahAnnMacklin, I'll pick 3 of you to come down to the studio to meet me and the guest I'm interviewing and watch the recording live. In your email and message to me, don't forget to also let me know who you'd like to see on the show. Oliver Burkeman, welcome to Live Well, Be Well. Thank you so much for being here.
thanks very much for having me on.
I am very excited about this conversation today for a multitude of reasons. One, because I resonate with a lot about what you talk about, especially when I was reading your new book. And I think it's a very important conversation today around productivity and being imperfect, as our world is only ever speeding up. It's not slowing down. And I think when I put questions out on social media on maybe people feeling that they need to achieve a certain way or being a certain type of productivity, the abundance of messages that I got in showed that we're in a state of overwhelmment on this topic, that more plus more equals success, which I learned very quickly actually isn't always the case. So my first question to you is kind of this productivity happiness paradox that I want to talk about. So why doesn't increased productivity guarantee a happier life? Because I think that's what we're all really promised. If we're very productive, we'll become very successful and we'll have a very happy life.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the promises that we are exposed to all the time. I think the context in which I'd put this is that the desire to become more and more productive is one really prevalent example of a broader thing where we want to feel more in control of our lives. We want to feel on top of things. We want to feel like everything's sorted out and we can sort of finally relax into the situation that we're in. But until we get to that, we got to put in more self-discipline and yell at ourselves a bit more and keep looking for really good systems to handle it all. And, you know, we can go into this now or later or not at all, but I think ultimately what's going on there is our deep discomfort with the whole human condition and ultimately our mortality. So it goes deep and wide. But the reason you won't get there through productivity is because, well, in the deepest sense, it's because the kind of security we're looking for is not something that we get to have as humans, right? That sense of being on top of an infinite supply of things, right? If there's an infinite number of things you could do, or just more things you could do with your time than you're ever going to be able to do, which I think is a structural truth about being human. It's not because you haven't found the right technique yet or put enough energy in yet, then you're never going to get to that kind of security. You're going to have to look elsewhere for a sense of like deep engagement and fulfillment in life. And so what happens if all you do is try to optimize and get more efficient, because what you're dealing with is an effectively infinite supply of emails, of demands from other people, of projects you want to launch, places you want to travel, you never get to the end of it because that's not how infinite supplies work. You just get busier and more stressed. So the obvious example always that I like to talk about is email, because everyone knows it. If you get really good and fast at responding to your email, the result is that you get much more email, much more quickly. So the reward, as people say, for good time management is more work. So that's why it doesn't bring peace of mind.
There's so many angles I could go off this. I think that especially if you look on Twitter or X, let me reframe, you will have the top 10 ways to increase your productivity, the top 10 ways I found to streamline my life this year. There's always these things that can make it more, especially with AI coming out now, there's so many more ways that we can be more adaptable to having more of a productive life.
Right. And the people putting them out on social media don't even need to write the content because AI can do that as well. So
exactly.
Everyone's happy.
So how does your thought process work around this? Because I do feel very much at what I would say I've succumbed to that. I'm trying to always think about ways that I could adapt to grow using technology. But again, at the same time, I'm putting more increased demands on how I can grow quickly. And so how do you kind of navigate your way through that? Because I know one thing that you talk about is not having a to-do list, which is kind of the very basic of the productivity to start.
Yeah, I'm not like an advocate for definitely ripping up your to-do list, but I think it's really, the basic point, and it's part of the sort of, certainly the downgrading of the role of things like to-do lists in your life, is to sort of start by asking, what's the emotion, what's the thing that people want when they are drawn to that material that says, here are 5 ways to streamline your life. And I'm drawn to it too, by the way. It's just that I've kind of seen through it in some way. I still totally feel that kind of, oh, maybe this is the thing, that's finally going to sort it all out. And I think the yearning there is, as we've already touched on, right? The yearning there is this feeling of like this future point of, okay, now I'm in charge of it all. Now nothing can surprise me. Now I don't have to be exposed to the risk of like distressing emotions or disappointing people or anything like that. I'm in command. And the sort of move that I guess I'm making in kind of in everything I write on some level, but on this topic, is to say, well, if you really look at the mismatch closely, the mismatch between what we can hope to do in our finite lives with our finite energy and attention and this kind of effectively infinite universe of things we could do, actually it's liberating. Because if you think that trying to get on top of everything is really difficult, then that makes life really agonizing and you're always looking for a new system or a philosophy or approach to solve the problem. But if you realize that it's worse than that, it's not really difficult, it's actually impossible. That's the point at which there's a kind of moment where you can exhale and let your shoulders drop.
Let go.
Not because you're saying, well, then why not do anything? Why bother doing anything? But precisely because it's when you let go of that impossible quest to get your arms around an infinite amount, that's when you can be free to like do the most important things that you're capable of and the most interesting things that are available to you and the most difference-making things in the world. So that's a point I'm always trying to emphasize, like, because there's a misunderstanding that you could make here, which would be, since we can't get on top of everything, let's just forget it and settle for mediocrity. And I really want to like rescue the idea of ambition and accomplishment and all of these things, but ambition and accomplishment as finite people, not once we've found a way to no longer be finite people, which is never gonna happen.
Well, I guess it's getting off that treadmill, right? Which eventually will end up leading to burnout, which is, I guess, ultimately what we all want to avoid. I think the reason why I mentioned about the list was because when I was reading your book, you said something that I actually implemented last year after I got a coach. And I had a point where I felt very overwhelmed. So first thing is I get a coach and I'm trying to like work out how I can become more strategic with my time. And she said, well, what would actually make you feel better about what you have achieved? Because for me, it was always what I haven't achieved, what I've still got to do. So what I started to do, I've kept doing this now since the beginning of last year, is I've written down what I have achieved at the end of each day.
Yeah, done list.
So it's the done list.
Yeah.
And you put this when I listened to your book on audio as well when I was walking, and I thought, oh, I've already done that.
That's brilliant. You've already done the done list.
I've already done the done list. Yeah. But it really resonated with me because I'd never, ever taken a moment to go, well, these are all the things that you have done. I would just work my way through the day and all I would think is, oh my gosh, I've still got all of this left to do. I'd have no accountability of anything that I'd done. And that was putting me into was never getting anything done mindset. So I really resonated with that. But then it brought me to a question of, well, work-life balance. Is that even a thing with everything that we're talking about? Do you believe in work-life balance? Is that something that you think is achievable? Or do you think we're always in flux and it's never actually as achievable as people make it out?
I mean, I think it's just a really strange idea when you start to think about it. I think it's often well-meaning, and that feeling that your life is balanced in some sense is absolutely a sort of legitimate thing. But I think very often what it really gets communicated as, or how people hear it, is as extra pressure, right? As a desire to sort of be 100% in the work realm and also 100% in the realm outside work. In fact, I think something more useful is a sense of like seasonality, right? There may be times in your life when being imbalanced in the direction of work is the right approach, and other times when being imbalanced in the direction of life outside work is the right approach, and that is actually balance over the long haul. So I think it's a little bit arbitrary, right? I think the question should be, given your situation, given the world we live in, given the pressures that are on all of us, how far are you managing to sort of spend a pretty big chunk of your day doing things that really sort of absorb you and make you feel more alive? And it kind of doesn't matter whether they are work or non-work, provided that that's part of a sort of, financially sustainable situation and everything. So I've sort of left the notion behind, but maybe not the spirit of it.
So how, for you personally, do you bring this into your life, into a concept? So the done list was one thing that we spoke about, but for many people listening to this who are starting to relate to this concept, what for you has been quite significant in this approach, and what do you do daily that kind of helps you stick with this?
So, I mean, I think I'm probably at an extreme end in terms of the amount of autonomy that I have over my work time, not the time around the sides of work, because we've got a 7-year-old and there are all sorts of things that just, it's the rhythm of the house. But there is this chunk of the day, every weekday, when I really do get to call the shots. And I do appreciate that's not true for everybody, but it's usually truer for people than they think to a certain extent. And I think the principles underlying it are more widely applicable. So one of the things that I do is I try really hard to concentrate the kind of core work that I do, the thing that is the central value of it, which is writing and to some extent reading and thinking and walking around, thinking about things. I do a lot of writing in the form of walking, into a kind of a 3 or 4 hour chunk of the working day. So I try quite hard to ring fence that time, but I also don't try very hard to ring fence or defend the rest of the time. So there's a sort of natural movement from the degree to which I can control my time and my focus, and then the part of the day where I'm kind of not even trying and I'm just rolling with whatever, answering emails, getting calls, serendipitous stuff is happening. And I think that is I write about that in the new book, that there's actually this pattern going back all the way through history. You look at the working patterns of artists and authors and scientists and everybody. This number, 3 or 4 hours for really deep focused work, is incredibly, it recurs again and again. And anyway, the spirit underneath this that I think is so important is just this idea of like, I'm going to work on something and then it's going to be time to stop. And it's going to be time to stop because it's time to stop, not because I have got to the end of all the things that needed doing in that slot. So this is almost like a feeling. It's very hard to describe, let alone turn into specific techniques. But it's like, it's that sense that you are moving through finite time, making some sensible choices about what to do with the finite time, and then stopping just because a new part of finite time, otherwise known as the evening or whatever, has come around. And that gradually undermines that sense of doing things the other way, where you start off in the morning by thinking, what are all the things that need to get done by the end of today? Instantly, you're going to come up with a list that is got no relationship to your actual amount of time or energy. And then you're just going to feel bad about yourself when you only get 1/5 of the way through it by the end. So it's almost like, to me, and maybe this is getting weird and obscure now, but to me, this feeling is almost like sort of walking into a strong wind, right? It's like when you're out on the hills and there's like a wind blowing in your face and you're just, it doesn't stop you moving forward, but you're sort of moving in this deliberate way through some things, writing them on a done list when you've done them, hopefully, because then you can sort of appreciate that you've done them. And it's kind of bracing, right? It's not like sort of being carried downhill on a stream or something, so that you're getting more and more and more and more done, and by the end you'll be completely done. No, it's just like, okay, I took a few paces along the path today, and I'm satisfied with that. Does that make sense, or am I just talking nonsense at this point?
No, it does make sense. The concept, I love the kind of going against the wind, because I do think sometimes people can wake up every day with a weight on their shoulders and go to bed with a weight on their shoulders. And I hear all the time in clinic or from people who write into the show that they're waking up at 3 a.m. with all their lists, and they'll have a pen and paper next to their bed and they'll write all the things they need to do. And from what I'm hearing of you is that can create anxiety, which is also very, if I'm looking at what I'm being told or how I would also react, it does cause anxiety. This never-ending to-do list. I don't think I've known anyone that's gone, I did everything today. There's always something else to add on. But we do live in this productivity method. Like Ali Abdul has been on the show. Mm-hmm. We have had so many different people have come on and spoken about productivity. And I very much succumb into that, but I've also realized actually that I can put a lot more pressure on myself when I'm in that state. And so I think that we do live in a way in this world that is curated towards that. And going against the wind, it's kind of going against what the environment is that we're in. So what would you say to that if somebody says, well, I understand, but I feel that I'm trapped in this circuit, that there is a forever ending to-do list and I can't get away from it?
I mean, here I think I come back to this idea that it's really about seeing how irredeemable this situation is, right? So one thing that I do, although I have really downgraded the role of a to-do list in my life in the sense of, here are the 20 things I must do by the end of the day, otherwise I'm not a valid person and haven't earned my right to exist. I do keep an incredibly long list, changes the form I keep it in, but basically just an incredibly long list of everything that's on my plate, everything that I might want to do, everything I said I'll potentially do, so that it's all there in this spirit of, this comes originally in my life from a book called Getting Things Done by the productivity guru David Allen, who wrote it a couple of decades ago now. This notion of just getting it all out of your head onto a list. But that list is, precisely because that list is so long, it's actually quite hard to feel anxious about it, because you look at that list and you just say, okay, this is effectively infinite, right? This is all the things that are sort of in my life. I don't, as I've sort of worked on myself in this regard, like I no longer sort of feel stressed by the sheer length of that list because it seems so long, right? Because it's clearly
unachievable.
Right. It's just a list of it's much more like a menu, in other words, right? It's much more like a menu of all the things that like I'm interested in doing. And then one of the ways that I work is maybe to take a small number of things off that list, put them onto a sort of a list of a much shorter list, where I have sort of like a fixed number of slots. So maybe there's only like 5 items that can go onto those things. And the rule is that you can't add another one until you've moved one off, right? So then you're sort of saying, okay, this is the world of things that I could do, but this is the ones that are on my plate at the moment. And all I'm going to do is put a few hours into moving them forwards. I do get that obviously people may say, well, I've just got to be able to work at this kind of hell for leather pace in my role because that's just what the job is. But it's still the case, no matter who you are, that you can't do more than you can do, right? That, like, you can't do the impossible. That's why they call it impossible. So I think in that context, it's really useful to really sort of try to feel into this sense that we are not, it's not that we've got like a bucket of tasks and it's our job to empty the bucket. It's that we're sort of swimming in an infinite ocean of tasks, and our job is to get good at swimming and swimming in the right direction and making good choices about how to swim. That metaphor sort of getting extended further than it should. But so there's something that encapsulates this for me, which I talk about a lot because it always gives me goosebumps to do so, is this line from a British-born Zen teacher called Hoon Jiu Kennet, who she died a while ago now, but she always used to say that her method of teaching was not to lighten the burden of the student, but to make it so heavy that he or she would put it down. And there's something in this that just completely connects with my, whatever it is, my parasympathetic nervous system or something. You're the expert on that matter. But there's something sort of totally physiological about that idea. Okay, it's not that I have to keep struggling to the point where I don't feel burdened by all the things that could be done. It's that by understanding just how many things there will always be that could be done, I can see that it's not my job to try to lighten that burden. I can put that burden down, take a deep breath, and now decide, what would be the most important things for me to give my time and energy to. And they might be really annoying, urgent chores that people are nagging you about. That might, on a given day, be the right calculation, but not because I'm just a few days away from the moment where I'm finally in control of everything.
I love that you just said, the physiology of it it makes me calm. It reduces your stress response. Your cortisol is coming down. Your parasympathetic nervous system is being activated because you realize it's kind of out of your control. And stress is our biggest killer. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, is actually if we can take control and harness our stress, we can have a happier, healthier life. And it brings me on to the question, as you were saying with that quote, is being busy without purpose. And I have found myself being stuck in a shell of busyness without actually a real purpose of why I'm busy, because I just feel like I need to be busy. And having time off, as you said, to creatively think or to allow your brain to be more open, because some of my best ideas come when I'm not sat at a desk writing.
Right, absolutely.
It's like redefining how our productivity can then align with meaningful achievements as opposed to busyness.
Yeah, no, totally. It's so easy to be in that kind of frenetic place where it almost feels like it must be useful because it's so exhausting. But there's no reason to believe that because something is very taxing of your energies that it's therefore useful or meaningful or making a difference. And just as there's no reason to believe that if something is easy and feels easy and easeful, that must mean it's worthless. But I think a lot of us are raised in some sense and imbibe from the culture this sense that, yes, we'd like lots of success and happiness in our lives, but what we really want is to feel like we were good boys and girls in terms of how much effort we put in to achieving it. And I think that is one of the things that feeds that sense of just pushing, because there's some sort of moral benefit in the sheer fact of pushing.
As a nutritionist, one of the most common questions that I get asked is coffee good or bad for you? Yes, coffee is good for you, but the impact of the health benefits all comes down to how the coffee is sourced and made. What's really important to consider when choosing your coffee is knowing that not all coffee is created equally. I came across Exhale Coffee by Dr. Rupi, who oversaw 9 independent lab tests to ensure the coffee is sourced to maximize the polyphenol content. This is a potent antioxidant with anti-inflammatory properties to support overall health. Switching to a high polyphenol coffee like Exhale is also fantastic for your gut health and your brain health, because research has shown that these specific components may have a real impact on our immune response. It could even help support your oral microbiome when drinking up to 2 to 3 cups a day. But over 5 a day has been shown to have detrimental effects. Personally, I love to have my coffee an hour after waking up to allow my body to use its own natural energy resources within the first hour and to align with my circadian rhythm. What I also love about Exhale Coffee is that it's also soil certification organic certified, which means that it's free from mycotoxins, pesticides, and molds. Now, if you want to give your mornings a new routine and try Exhale Coffee, then head to www.exhalecoffee.com/Sarah to get your free trial sent to you.
Well, you spoke about, Mortals as a title of your book, but thinking about mortality, you write that we might only have around 4,000 weeks to live. Which actually, when you think about it, you're like, okay, that is a very finite time. how can we align? And it's very hard. I do find the word around purpose very difficult because I think it is and can be sometimes misconstrued that we all must have this deep, deep purpose to go off and find enlightenment, which, I think purpose can literally just be having a family and something that you feel that's very purposely connected to or not. But how can we navigate that we are online with our authenticity and purpose or whatever that feels like, as opposed to just being, as you said, kind of a victim to our emails and sitting on our emails for 8 hours a day? How can we navigate that more with a more mindful mindset of these 4,000 weeks that we do have in a very finite time?
I mean, there's sort of two sides to that, I think. There's the side which is about figuring out whether the direction you're on in life is, quote, the right one or one of the many right ones. And then there's the sort of tactical question of how do you make time for that thing once you have or those things once you have a sense of what they are. So I guess on the first one, the thing about like, how do you even figure out what constitutes a meaningful life for you? In the new book, in Meditations for Mortals, which is kind of structured, I should just quickly say, as sort of 4 weeks of short daily chapters. And the idea is really to kind of get under your skin through reading it in the midst of all this overwhelm, right? So this is actually part of the answer to the question here. It's like, it's not about waiting for some big process or some vision quest you're going to go on later where you're going to figure out your life purpose. It's about making all these tiny little course adjustments right here today in the middle of life. And one of those, because there's a chapter on it in there, is this idea that comes from Carl Jung originally of the idea of the life task, the idea of asking yourself, like, what is the task that my life or reality is asking of me in this moment, in this phase of my life. And there's a whole story in there about Jung when he was an adolescent. I won't go into the whole detail, but basically, he was off school for kind of mysterious reasons. He had these fainting spells that no one could diagnose, and he overheard his father talking to a friend and saying, "I'm very, very worried because I've lost all my money, and if the young boy can't make something of himself, he's ruined. What's going to happen?" And of feeling that at that moment he was sort of colliding with reality, and he was aware that his task now was to kind of buckle down to his studies. And he talks about being thunderstruck by this feeling of like, oh, reality is asking this of me in this moment. It's a story that's very easy to misinterpret. Like, it doesn't mean hard work is always good, or it doesn't mean if you suffer from some kind of fainting related disease you can just work your way out of it. None of that. The point is just, we have these moments, and we could have more if we chose to have them, where you sort of look at your life and be like, oh yeah, it's not so much what do I want to get out of life at this moment, but actually like, this is what my life is asking of me right now. And it could be to work harder, it could be to get sort of established in business, but it could be to give yourself really sort of cut yourself some slack and rest. It could be to throw yourself into family life, but it could be to set up some boundaries around the obligations of family life. And people often know in an intuitive way what they don't know. I mean, it's been hard for me to learn.
Intellectual.
Right. What they don't know intellectually.
We over-intellectualize everything, and we're very disconnected from our bodies. It's a conversation that comes up all the time.
I personally am that person. Yes, no, absolutely. But I am gradually learning that there's this intuitive approach can be connected to by certain questions. Another Jungian question that comes from the therapist James Hollis is that sort of, is this path that I'm on at the moment one that enlarges me or diminishes me? And it's not the same as saying, is it fun or not, right? There are parts of life that are not fun and that are difficult, but that we should be going through. There are difficulties you can encounter in a relationship that are a red flag that mean get out of that relationship. And then there are difficulties you can encounter in a relationship which are all part of growing and maturing and becoming more of who you are. And then to make this even easier, I think another idea from Carl Jung that really you're only ever responsible to the very next moment, right? You're only ever asking yourself, well, whatever the answer to this question is about my life task or what reality is asking of me, it's only about what I do next. It isn't about where I see myself in 5 years' time or anything.
We don't have control of that.
Stressful like that. No, it's just doing the next right thing, as Jung and also Anna from Frozen says. So you choose your philosophical influence. So I think that's a really important part of it. And yeah, it's different from these very oppressive notions of destiny and calling and purpose, because I think one of the problems with those is people often feel like they've got a destiny or a purpose and that their life is blocking it, right? They can't do it because they were meant to do X, but here they are doing Y. And obviously it's fundamental to the notion of a life task that it will be something you can do in your life. It's what your life is asking of you right now. So if you don't have more than £50 in the bank, it's not going to be something that requires you to have £100,000 in the bank. If you are unable to have biological children, it's not going to be that your destiny or purpose is to become a biological parent, right? That's not the question here. The question is like, I'm right here in this reality. What is this reality asking? I think that's very powerful.
Big reflective question that I think many of us are never taught to ask. I think one of those things that when I said we're two in our minds and disconnected from our bodies, and you very much agreed, is that we're only taught to intellectualize our lives. I mean, we literally go to school from a very early age and we're taught to intellectualize everything. We're never taught to intuitively connect or understand what our emotions are or ask these questions. So I think everybody is at risk of that. And if you're the other way, you kind of somehow self-taught that and gone against the grain. So it feels very, very unfamiliar for us to intuitively connect. It feels very comfortable for us to intellectualize something.
And the other thing is we tend to have an amazing track record of how successful it is to intellectualize things, right? Great exam results and all the rest, you know? It's like you constantly reinforced in this that like it gets you places. Until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't.
Yeah, right.
And I think, so something that I am always very interested in is why people go into this work, because you've got an amazing newsletter called The Imperfectionist, which I very much relate to, and I will get you to define what an imperfectionist is, but also an insecure overachiever, which I believe that must be how you maybe relate to certain aspects of yourself, which is why that you feel purpose to write about it, because you can connect to it emotionally. But for people that have maybe never heard these two terms, could you maybe describe them a little bit more and why they are so essential to understand? Because it feels like you can fall very prison to this productivity method if you do connect to these terms.
Yeah, I mean, I use this. I didn't invent the phrase insecure overachiever. It's current in social psychology, but when I use it at events and things, it's like the looks of recognition on people's faces are just hilarious. Basically, I mean, this is the idea of the kind of person who is driven and probably successful and probably quite possibly sort of celebrated by their friends or even by a wider society for their successes, but who on some level ultimately is doing that all to try to sort of fill a hole inside, to try to feel like finally they're adequate and sufficient people. So it's this kind of odd situation when you think about it for a moment of really feeling like not enough, and as a result doing things that by most other people's standards might count as sort of more than enough, all in the service of like hopefully getting to this point where you could maybe say, okay, I'm just about okay as a person now, even though what's probably got completed in the world as a result of that could be like, you know, quite strikingly above average in terms of, you know, whatever field you're in. And yeah, I totally think I apply that to myself, and I think it's a good way of characterizing this feeling of always waiting to get to the future point where you've been productive enough to relax, or you've sort of earned your right to exist for the day. One of the many punishing things about it is that we don't really, there's something built into it that you're never going to get there, right? That even if you do put in an amazing day, you just have to start all over again the next day. And in the book, I write about this clip from a long forgotten TV show called Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip that many people will presumably never have heard of because it didn't make it past a single season, but in which the late and missed Matthew Perry is playing a TV producer who has like a week to put together this live show. And there's a clock, a big digital clock on the wall that counts down the days, hours, minutes and seconds to the point when they have to go on air. And it's there all the way through this episode, you know, just oppressively anxious. And he's like trying to keep up to try to get to this point. And he gets to the point where it's got seconds left to go and they go on air and the whole thing comes together and he meets his like deadline and the camera pans across to him watching in the gallery behind the scenes of this TV show. And his like, there's just a moment of like relaxed pleasure on his face, and it lasts like 1 second, and then you can see a thought strike him, and then the camera pans back over to the digital clock, and now it says, you know, 6 days, 23 hours, whatever, until the next time. And I think so many people relate to this feeling of like, oh, you mean my reward for having got to this place, even if it's just like the 6 p.m. in the day place, is that I just have to not only do it all over again, but ideally meet the same or exceed the same standard again tomorrow. And it turns success into a punishment, and it turns productivity into a source of extra anxiety, and it's rubbish, basically. So hence my interest in finding an alternative.
I could not relate to that more about that character, because something that I have also changed, which maybe is in your book, but it's celebrating the small wins. So for me, you know, I'm sure you've just written your 4th book. That's an incredible large win. Okay, that's something that I really hope you did celebrate. But it's the small wins every day of a conversation that went really well, or something that happened that we would so often overlook. And I really believe in those celebrations of the small wins, because otherwise we go through our life just constantly waiting for the next thing to happen without taking any recognition or any joy in those small wins, which I think is really, really key in that entire story. I think the reason why an insecure overachiever is so important is because, again, you're trying to fill a well, right, that you feel very empty in. And for me, that was my dyslexia.
Right.
So for me, I always was terrified about my writing. So for me, what was the thing I wanted to go and do? I wanted to go and write a book, or how I would speak, how I pronounce things. So for me, starting a podcast was really important. And all of those things that probably made me feel less as a person, I needed to fill. Yeah. But then realizing that all of that was coming from a place of filling as opposed to that was giving me a joyous way. Right. So kind of reworking with that narrative. And that's why a lot of my work now focuses on self-compassion. And I said to you earlier, I was listening, obviously, through the research of this, as well as like reading your fantastic book and all the, you know, the copious Guardian columns that you've written over the years, was listening to your conversation with Chris Williamson on his podcast. And a concept came up again, which is self-compassion, which was one of mine. I thought, great, Oliver's going to really get into this. And as you did, it was very interesting because you kind of mentioned, you know, or through this cringe lens when I mentioned this word self-compassion, and my body just wanted to cry and think, no, not through the cringe lens, but I am aware that for most British people, it's the most cringe thing that anyone can relate to, but it should be an acceptance of self-compassion. And so is this something that I want to know? One, how have you stopped being your own worst enemy? And how can we make this conversation so people don't feel that it's a narcissistic way of loving themselves, that actually it's a self-respect of how they would treat a friend?
I mean, yeah, I would say British people, perhaps specifically British men, you know, we're getting, there's all sorts of social and stereotyped sort of difficulties with getting to this notion. When it comes to the cringe, I think that's interesting because one of the things that I've written about before is that in this context and in others, I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that you have to sort of lean into the cringe, and that the cringe is telling you something, right? If I think about a whole area of personal development work, and I just sort of feel allergic to it, it's like, why is that? Maybe that's worth thinking about. And I think in the case of self-compassion, it's definitely that, right? It's like something vulnerable has been touched, and my cringe is a defensive reaction against it. So I sort of own up to the cringe when it comes to self-compassion stuff, but I also want to sort of go into that and beyond it. And I think, a place that begins, and this is maybe somewhere where sort of a British cultural context makes it harder, is that where your mind goes first of all is that you're being asked to feel that you are more special and precious than anyone else in the world, and few things are as opposed to the sort of ethos of British culture than the idea of thinking of yourself as special in that sense.
That's self-esteem.
Of specialness, right?
So self-esteem is when you think that you've got to be better than someone else. So,
Right.
and if you're not, then your self-esteem drops. And it's why it's a very bad telling sign of having a high self-esteem. Americans have very high self-esteem, funnily enough. And I spoke about this a lot with Dr. Kirsten Neff, but if you have a higher self-esteem, you always need to be better than someone. And not being better than someone makes you have a lower self-esteem. Self-compassion has an acceptance.
Yeah, no, right. I understand. That's a good way of distinguishing things. The breakthrough for me, or one of them, and it was a sort of an intellectual one, so it's only the beginning of a breakthrough, is to really understand the degree to which the standards that I hold myself to, or the ways that I talk to myself when I'm not in that self-compassionate space, are sort of would be wildly unacceptable if I were to focus them on anybody else, right? And there's a quotation, each of the chapters in this new book begins with a quotation from somebody else that makes the sort of perspective shift vivid, I think. And in that context, there's one from Adam Phillips, the psychoanalyst, who points out that, if you were to meet this person who so many of us have inside our heads during the day, like a drinks party or something, like they would, as he puts it, he would just be boring and cruel. That's the quote I like from that longer quotation. It's like you'd think there was something wrong with him. You would think, as Adam Phillips says, that he must be living in the aftermath of some catastrophe, and you would be right, which is a very, there's many depths to plumb there. But just like, this is not healthy behavior, right? The person who goes around saying that to their friends is, well, they're not their friends, right? Because it's obnoxious. So that helped me see that all I'm asking of myself here is equal friendship towards myself, as I'm already, I think, okay at applying to other people in life. So to me, perhaps to my sort of, the British part of me especially, that notion that it's just about equal treatment was very powerful. And then the other thing that was very powerful was realizing that there isn't a zero-sum game going on here. It isn't the case that if I'm friendlier towards myself, that means taking concern away from my family or from the people I work with or anything. It's the opposite. I'm just way less obnoxious, but way better to interact with when I'm coming from that place. So nobody loses. And maybe that's a bit sort of underhand because I'm justifying self-compassion by its benefits to other people, but if it gets you there, I think that might be okay.
I'm so excited to share something that has been a game changer for my business. As a nutritionist and a health professional, having an online presence that truly represents my brand is crucial. I built my website on Squarespace nearly 10 years ago now, and I'm so excited to partner with Squarespace and share with you the all-in-one platform that helps entrepreneurs and health professionals like us thrive online. Now, when I started to think about building my website, I was a bit overwhelmed. Now, you don't need to worry because the Squarespace Blueprint AI makes it easy. It feels like having a personal design assistant guiding me through creating a site that looks professional and uniquely tailored to my brand. It's been amazing for showcasing my services and connecting to you, my audience. One feature I love is the members sites. I've set up exclusive sections for my inner circle members to access premium content like courses, recipes, books, and expert blogs. It's a fantastic way to offer extra value, build a stronger community, and generate steady income. And let's talk SEO. Squarespace has built-in SEO features to help make sure my website is optimized for search engines, making it easier for people to find my site and join my community. If you're a health professional or brand looking to elevate your online presence, I highly recommend Squarespace. It's been vital for growing my brand and making real impact. Check out squarespace.com/livewell for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use the offer code LIVEWELL for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
course. I think there's so much around. I talk a lot about this on the motivation side of things. Whereas if you were to have an employee and you're basically telling them off every day that they're not good enough, that person's not going to want to work hard for you.
Right.
So similar with the person in your brain. If you're telling yourself every day that you're not good enough, your motivation to do better every time becomes a bit less and less until you feel that you're so overwhelmed that you can't keep up.
Yeah.
And that's also proven very much in scientific literature that self-compassion actually improves not only a growth mindset, but it also improves motivation. And I think that we've just become a little bit squiggled in our society of how we look at that term. And I do quite like that and I wrote that down, equal friendship, because I do think the term self-compassion has gone into this very much self-love era, which isn't how I would see self-compassion. You know, I would see it as treating yourself as you would treat someone that you respect.
There's something so powerful for me about just the idea of friendliness, right? That's the word that, for whatever reason, gets under my skin and past my defenses. And I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting then to think in these terms. You may have gone far further down this road already, but like how much sort of personal development, how many of our plans for new daily schedules to achieve our goals and morning routines that we're going to follow are kind of systematized self-aggression, right? They're kind of they're sort of under the guise of I'm going to make my life better. They are sort of new rules that we're going to impose sort of cruelly on ourselves in order to try to get ourselves to this stage of feeling adequate. And it's quite useful to sort of filter, like to approach those things. If you'll find some video or book that you're attracted to as a sort of life-changing thing, to really ask whether it's which part of you it's kind of activating, and whether it's the part that relishes the idea of punishing your future self or something.
It's true. I think there's so much to be said around vulnerability of doing it on your own, and obviously the acceptance of like, okay, these are the things that I have failed in, and that's not something to be ashamed of, something that I can learn from and grow. But so much of this concept has, for me, come through understanding that, and it's come from painful moments of vulnerability and failure. For you, like, what was it that there must have been moments where this has been really poignant for you to connect to this? And can I ask what those moments were that you have gone into this so much more on this certain concept of imperfectionism? Was there a moment when you were like, it's just not working for me anymore?
I mean, at least one moment. Yeah, I think there's a sort of, it's partly a life cycle thing, right? I think that one of the things that happens, I'm in my late 40s now. So I think one of the things that happens is that there are ways that serve you really well in young adulthood, and then they gradually sort of stop serving you. Perhaps, it differs for everyone, but perhaps into your 30s and early 40s, you begin to wonder like, oh, I'm just doing this in the same way that I've always done it, but for some reason it's not delivering the same results. So I think I've had a number of those. I write in my earlier book, 4,000 Weeks, about, it was very much an intellectual epiphany again. So my epiphanies tend to be intellectual, and then my change tends to be slow and gradual, but the sitting on a park bench in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, feeling even more anxious than usual about all the things I was trying to fit into that week, and trying to figure out what combination of time management tricks I could use to squeeze them all in and feel okay about it all, and just suddenly being struck very powerfully by the realization of like, oh, it's impossible. Oh, I'm trying to do something impossible. Oh, great. All right. That's a burden lifted, right? It's like, okay, it's not going to work. It's like trying to make 2 + 2 = 5. So now we have to do something else. That was important. And then in the writing of this most recent book, I often think that writing is actually the crucible for me that helps me do this, because if you're trying to do something that is so connected to your like unconscious, and trying so hard to be honest and authentic in what you're doing, and like it stops and you're not making progress, that's a really useful sign. And then you sort of have to course correct. And so what I'm always finding is that I do have to slightly change my personality in order to finish each new book, and I have to change it in the direction of the thing that I'm writing about. So I've done the book proposal where you're all in your intellect and figuring it out and setting out the idea. And then the process of actually writing it is the process of actually living into that initial conceptual thought. So I kind of use these books to.
So what was the
to
biggest
change.
chapter for you then of all of, because they're all very short, and that's what I love about them. Being dyslexic, I like that the attention is short and sweet and you can do it every day. But from all of the chapters that you did over those 4 weeks, which for you was the most of the 28? Which was the one that was the most profound for you?
Well, I think it's all of the ones that are grouped in week 3, which is called Letting Go, which is not just about acceptance, but also about the sense in which getting important things done in life is very often a matter of letting them happen rather than making them happen. And if I had to pick one inside that, it might be the one on just sort of allowing the possibility that things might be easy instead of assuming that they're going to be grueling and hard. But that whole week, that the movement of that week is the sort of gesture of it, I suppose, I think of is like unclenching and untensing, and not like, and then just kicking back and doing nothing, but precisely untensing in order to let sort of action flow. And that's definitely like the place of my own ongoing challenge.
Of letting go of control.
Letting go of control, but it's almost, but it ties into the embodied stuff, because it really is a question of a kind of, this is something I'm struck by again and again, how far when I'm in the sort of stressed and insecure overachiever mode, it's a physical thing, right? It's to do with, it's like I think that physically bracing myself in a certain way, or tensing my muscles, or like furrowing my brow is somehow how I'm going to get to this point of feeling in control or feeling adequate or something. And the job of relaxing into the flow of life is, to very large extent, I think, a job of physically relaxing into it. But I'm right at this, talking now here, right at the leading edge of the things I'm thinking about. So I don't know what I'm talking about at this point. And
You do, because you've written a book on it, so you must know what you're talking about. Otherwise, that would be...
Well, I think the book is, in many ways, the book is definitely written for people who sort of navigate by their heads, and it's based around sort of undermining some aspects of that and bringing you back to your body. But what I mean is that the part where you are sort of then in your body, I'm a total work in progress in that. I feel like there's definitely further
breath work.
There's definitely further places to go. Is that your recommendation?
Doing some breath work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Getting into your body. Taking yourself out of but you're also doing more than you think. I think the environment is a huge, huge place.
Right.
Grounding, going outside, putting your feet on the ground, that has a huge impact on our cortisol and stress levels and our sympathetic to parasympathetic. You're physically connecting to nature. So all of these things have such a kind of a profound influence on getting us out of our minds and into our bodies. But I do think it's so important to, again, then be that very kind of compassionate self-talk and say, actually, but this is the society and culture that we've grown up in, to be in our minds. Yeah. So for me, it's not a natural instinct as well to be self-compassionate. We're not neurowired to be compassionate to ourselves, or neurowired to be the other way. And I think that also then allows us to go, well, actually, it's harder work to become compassionate to ourselves. Yeah. But I can get there. And now I'm aware of it. That's the innate instinct, is to actually be very self-critical, because it's to survive. Yeah. But I don't need to survive by being harsh. Yeah. So that understanding is I think, again, allows you to go, okay.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I'm not doing this wrong because I'm actually doing it right. My brain's actually telling me that I need to be critical to survive. But now I realize I don't.
That's really interesting, because it ties into something I've written about elsewhere. It's not that I've written about that elsewhere, but this general notion that positive change feels awkward on some level, and learning to distinguish between the feeling of like an intuitive feeling that something is dangerous or bad for you in your life, which should be listened to, and your unconscious is incredibly more wise than your rational brain in that context, versus this sense of like, well, that's kind of uncomfortable and awkward, and it feels a bit like putting on like ill-fitting clothes or something. And that's actually a sign that it's the right direction, I think, right? Because that's the sign that you're pushing against that conditioning. And yet, when you're not thinking or you're tired or whatever, like the first moment of that feeling can be enough to be like, oh, screw this, and go and do something else. Yeah, right.
Or you fall into something that's very easy and comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if there's so much of kind of about wanting to, the self-improvement sector, it can be very uncomfortable. But I do think, it's about becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable, but also knowing that it's not a natural instinct.
Yeah.
That's the very powerful concept. So kind of bringing this together, you've obviously put a 4-week plan. Thinking about this, what are kind of, and I know that again, it's very hard to always put these in tools, but for somebody actually wanting to let go a bit more of control, or this desire that to have this very hard, productive mindset is going to have a happy, successful life, what are the 3 things, or where should people start on this concept to have this kind of more calmer life that isn't so task focused all the time and letting go into that insecure overachiever? What are the couple of things that people could do?
I mean, I'll offer one thought, and then I will offer another thought that kind of opposes the question in a way, because I think it's useful. But so I think one thing that I think has been a really important thing for me is what I think of as morning pages, but really any kind of journaling, any kind of free form journaling. So I'm talking about spending 30, 40 minutes almost every morning writing 3 sides of a narrow ruled, people always want to know the details, 3 sides of a narrow ruled hardback notebook, but none of that is important. The important part is that you put some kind of temporal frame around it and just write freely in that time for no audience other than yourself. And for me, that is a powerful way to sort of ease into some of these ways of thinking and being. The jury is out in my mind as to how far that is a sort of a path to embodiment, given that it is sort of inherently language-based and thought-based. But I do think that there's something very powerful about just saying to yourself, I'm going to write without stopping, not super fast or anything, but just, I'm not going to only write something when I know what it is I want to write. I'm just going to let the pen move and see what comes. And that is in itself, obviously, if you do it, well, even if you type it, but especially if you do it longhand, I think that is a practice that is sort of physical as much as it is anything else. And I've found that really useful. However, I think that there is also, this is the second part of my answer, there is a temptation to be like, okay, this sounds useful and interesting. So what are the habits that I need to develop in order to be like that? And part of what I'm taking aim at in a way is that whole attitude that says, what are the habits that I first need to put in place before I can be more sort of fully absorbed and enlivened by my own life? And that can very easily lead right back into the same problem of like, well, okay, for the next few months, I'm going to work on like becoming this and meditating every day. And then finally, maybe I'll be allowed to just sort of enjoy life. So what I always say instead is like, the thing that you should do is, identify something in your life that in your heart you want to have more of in your life. So it could be a aspect of your work that you want to focus on more. It could be a creative project or a hobby. It could be a relationship you would like to be nurturing but you haven't been doing. It could be a recreational activity. And just actually do 10 minutes of that today. Like actually sweep away all this kind of like, what am I going to put in place so that I can do these things? And just do that thing, however badly, however unconfidently, with however little certainty that you're ever going to come back and do it again, right? Not once today and then every day for the rest of your life, but just once. And I think there's something in that willingness to just let yourself go on a run, let yourself look up an old friend, let yourself do some drawing. Whatever. I'm just picking examples at random, without it being part of some big new project of life transformation, but just doing it today, or if you're listening or watching late at night, then tomorrow is okay, but not in 3 weeks' time. And if that means putting something else to one side, then that's what it means. And if it means you can only afford to do it for 10 minutes because of all the other things you've got to do, then fine. It's like constantly bringing down that standard that needs to be met in order to let yourself do something that makes you feel more alive.
That reminds me of a friend actually that said to me last week, she was an avid reader and she had stopped reading. So she made a promise to herself that every day for 10 minutes, I'm just going to read a book. Just 10 minutes. That's all I'm going to do. Doesn't matter where I am, but I want to just read a book. And that was one thing that she wanted to do. So she started just with 10 minutes.
Yeah. And that's great. And the only thing I would say that is in any way objecting to it is like, if that even feels like too much, forget the everyday. It's like 10 minutes today. Don't worry if there's another, and then you might find that you do it the next day and the next day and the next day. Great. But like, even that bar you don't have to reach. You have to read for 10 minutes once. And then you have spent 10 minutes of your finite time on the planet doing something that you love, and that matters in and of itself.
Well, you hope that because you get joy from it, you're going to want to do it
Exactly.
more often.
The secret, the sort of unspoken part is that you end up with a habit, but you're not needing to sort of force a habit into your life.
Yeah, of course. I guess that's made me think, actually, the more that you really enjoy something, you will put more time into it once you start making space for it. I think the worry here is that you'll do something because you think you should be doing it, whether it's going to progress you into another stage of your career or progress you into something. You're integrating that into your life because you think you should be doing it, as opposed that it's actually giving you happiness to do it.
Yeah. And it's going to work better anyway for those instrumental goals. It's going to work better for those if you are really enjoying it anyway. Yeah.
So my last question to you, Oliver Burkeman, is one that I end the podcast with everybody, which is, what does live well, be well mean to you?
I think that it means feeling more fully alive. And I think there comes a point when this can't be put into words. I think there's something about showing up more completely for experience, which I know is ultimately the meaning of life and the meaning of living well and being well. And how exactly this is manifested in physical health is a kind of a slightly mysterious thing to me, but it's because I go naturally, first of all, to the sort of intellectual side of it, of course, but it is this sense of greater aliveness. There's Joseph Campbell, the great sort of scholar of myth and things, has this wonderful line. He says that he doesn't think people are looking for a meaning of life like they think they are. He thinks they're looking for a feeling of aliveness. And on some level, language can't capture this because obviously in some sense, we're fully alive our whole lives, right? We're not dead. But we also all know those times when there's a sort of more complete absorption in what's going on. Not a total absorption, because that would be perfectionism as well, but just that sort of vibrant, tingling sense that you're here, instead of just sort of going through the motions. And to me, that's what it has to ultimately all be about, I think.
Being present.
Indeed.
It's huge. Oliver, thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. I will link everything in the show notes. People that want to buy your new book, Meditation for Mortals, I would definitely recommend. I actually read this for me in 3 days. So I would definitely recommend getting the book, and everything else I'll put in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Live Well, Be Well. The one ask that I would have if you have enjoyed this episode is to leave a review. It really helps get the show out to more people, which is the main mission of me bringing this episode to you today and the entire of the show. And until next week, I wish you a lovely week.